Now, it's time to look at a couple of other characters that Socrates is going to bring into our story in dealing with the Theaetetus. So, where are we? We are back in the Theaetetus, lines 152 to 3. We've been talking about our second definition of knowledge. Go back and have a review of a previous video for that. Episteme as a thesis, perception. Perception, remember, is a complicated notion, and we use it in a variety of ways. So this is what Socrates is dealing with. A whole pile of stuff is going on. This is our definition that we're really going to dig into. Now, I should warn you that Socrates is going to spend several pages, in a way, talking talking about aesthesis, because ultimately he wants to get it out of the way. He wants to get rid of this equivalency, this link of episteme and aesthesis. He wants to get around this. But in order to get around it, he's going to examine it from all sides. What does it mean? What does it lead to? Do we accept what it leads to? And so on. So, digging in more, don't lose sight of what we're doing. We're trying to examine what aesthesis really is, whether it's a good thing that we should think it means the same as episteme. In other words, we're doing a major critique on the notion that knowledge is perception. That's why I have a little K equals P. Knowledge is perception. Episteme as aesthesis. Now, what are we doing here? In a short little exchange, Socrates moves quite a vast amount, through a vast amount of philosophy, and there's a lot of disagreement as to what's going on here. No surprise there. But what's the disagreement? Well, what is Socrates really up to here? And the links that Socrates makes, are they good? Does he take it really seriously? Because there's a little tongue-in-cheek stuff going on here. It's not clear what Plato is exactly doing. So this gets into broader problems of how to interpret the dialogue. But don't worry, for our purposes here, we're going to take a fairly straightforward and as non-controversial as we can. But pretty well anything you want to say about these dialogues, somebody eventually will disagree. So what's going on? Well, we're moving from this second definition of knowledge. Remember, episteme aesthesis, knowledge as perception, K equals P, knowledge as perception. We're going from that over to some historical figures, Protagoras, and then on to Heraclitus. Now, if you haven't studied Protagoras, and if you haven't studied Heraclitus, don't worry, because it's arguable as to whether or not Socrates is using the real ideas of the historical figure known as Protagoras. Protagoras was indeed a real historical figure of the time. Plato does give him a lot of respect in other dialogues, but we're not going to get into that here. We're just going to follow along and take it with a grain of salt whether or not it's really the real Protagoras and, of course, the real Heraclitus is thought. So let's not worry about those historical details. As interesting as I think they are, we don't have to dig in here. Now, a couple of things then. We go from episteme as aesthesis to Protagoras' homo mensura thesis. Now, he doesn't use that term. I'm going to use it. A number of other scholars use it, so we'll go with that. And I'll abbreviate that by HT. So homo mensura thesis, right? Man, human, mensura, measurement. To Heraclitus' flux thesis. So we can, why not? Flux thesis. Okay? Don't worry if you don't know what these don't mean. Don't worry if you don't understand them. We'll get into it in a second. The homo mensura thesis, in the context of this discussion, will be man is the measure of all things. And that's not actually that inaccurate. We have pretty good cause to believe that that's largely what Protagoras said. Now, if we were to really dig into this in great detail and plow our way through the ancient Greek, which I'm not going to do, just a little touch of Greek is enough for us, you'll find that this is a pretty ambiguous expression. Ambiguous does not mean vague. Ambiguous, remember, means that it could have clear meanings, but different ones. So you're not sure which meaning to accept. Vague means nothing's clear. might have piles of meanings, but you can't figure anything out. Ambiguous means multiple but not clear, or clear, multiple, but not sure which one to pick. So, again, boiling our discussion down, man is the measure of all things. I have the G for general homomensurothesis and sort of, shall we say, singular homomensurothesis. Two ways to interpret it. In the general one, it says something like, yeah, exactly what it says here. Man is the measure. It's a general notion. Like we would say today, maybe a cultural view. Cultures measure things, like a cultural relativism, if you like. A culture is the standard. Cultural codes are the measuring sticks, right? So when you want to know whether something is right or wrong or whatever, you look to a culture. But it doesn't just apply to ethics. If you also want to know what's right or wrong in mathematics, who do you talk to? You go talk to the mathematicians. How do we know that a mathematical proof works? The mathematicians say it does. Do they just vote on it? No, they use their reasoning and all these skills. But again, it is that community. Same thing with science and whatnot. It involves communities making these kinds of judgments. All right, so that's one way you can kind of read what's going on here with man is the measure. The homomensurothesis can be the general one, but the specific one seems to be more of what Socrates is going to get into here, and it relates more to what we discussed earlier in the notion of perception. A thesis having this ground of certainty, right? So when I say I'm perceiving a red patch now, I can't be wrong about my claim that I'm at least perceiving it. I could be wrong if I say, well, the red patch that I know I'm perceiving is actually got a correlate in the external world, that, yeah, there's really a red patch on the wall, when it could be just simply that, I don't know, I'm having a hallucination or something. But at least I am in that hallucination perceiving that red patch. So let's go with that. That seems to be more of what's going on here. So as X, whatever X happens to be, red patches or whatnot, so it appears to be, so it is to be. That's all there is to be said for this. That's how things are. As they appear, that's how they are. And the same for you. So we would sometimes say, my truth, your truth, that kind of stuff. So it's a strong sense of relativism in here, and Plato was not a fan of relativism. But that's a topic for another lecture. We'll see later on how Plato does come to the point of view that relativism in knowledge is fundamentally, it's wrong, and it doesn't fit with the very notion of knowledge. You can't have individual truths, right? You've heard that expression. You're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. All right, so we're going to go with this very sort of the smaller, more personal notion of the homomensurothesis. And so Socrates says, yeah, so this is great. Thanks for this second definition. Let's go with that. Protagoras says something similar to that. So bang, off and running, we've moved from knowledge is perception to this version of the homomensurothesis. So Socrates is moving along here. Again, some scholars say these links are not very well made, don't take them seriously. Other scholars try to argue that no, this all makes perfect sense. All right, Socrates then turns into an issue that's referred to as the cold wind discussion. All right, and in the cold wind discussion, like a variety of things, this has been read in a number of ways. And I'll give you a couple of ways to look at it before we then move on and go on to the Flux thesis. All right. What Socrates seems to be saying is that if you think, what he's trying to do is that if you think that this knowledge is perception really holds, he's trying to say, well, if you think this is the case, then you're going to have to lead into this one, and then you're going to have to lead into that one. So if you like, you can see it as if knowledge equals perception, then Protagoras' homomensurothesis, then Heraclitus' Flux thesis. Okay? That's the structure of really, in one way, is going on here. Okay? This is a very standard way of arguing in philosophy. And what you can do is that if you want to show that this is problematic, if you show that this is absurd, then it shows that if this is absurd, then this one's absurd, and then that one's absurd. So that's roughly what's going on here. But we'll see that as we go along. For now, let's just concentrate on this cold wind discussion. So what is this? Well, simply put, there's a wind blowing. So just a wind blowing. And we've all had this, right, where you say, it's freezing. And your friend says, no, it's not. It feels fine to me. I'm freezing. So this is quite common, right? There's always people in houses in the winter, and some people are saying, turn it up. It's freezing here. Turn the furnace up. And the next person says, what are you talking about? I'm cooking. Summer, same way. Turn the air conditioning up. I'm boiling. No, turn it down. It's freezing in here. People often disagree on their perceptions. So the wind blowing feels cold to A, feels warm to B. So which one is it? The wind in itself. What's that? Is it cold? Is it warm? What is it? Right? So that's our, shall we say, our ontological question. And these seem to be your subjective sides. Well, there seems to be a bit of a puzzle here. Is A correct or is B correct? Both can't be correct. And can you really have contradictory properties simultaneously? Yeah, one day the wind could be cold, and the next day it could be warm. We don't have any problems with that. I mean, there's no problems to say, yeah, last week my fence was brown and then I painted it, now it's white. Nobody would say that's a contradiction. But it can't be brown and white simultaneously, right? It can't. I mean, I could paint half the fence. The first example, the colors were separated by time. We could separate the colors by space. Yeah, I painted one half of the fence brown, and I painted the other half white. Separation by space, no contradiction there. Still, could the wind, though, be both cold and warm at the same time? It seems that some of these perceptions are wrong. But as Socrates says, remember, the perceptions can't be wrong, right? Knowledge is going to be perception. It cannot be wrong. So we can't say that either of these are wrong. They both have to be right. But what does that say about reality? How would we think about this? Well, maybe we could interpret this, think about it in one way, sometimes called the candy cane interpretation. Right. Just like, you've heard about the story of the blind man and the elephant, right? Each of them feels one part of the elephant, right? One guy feels a leg and says it's like a tree. One guy feels the side of the elephant, right? On its ribs or something. He says, oh, it's flat. It's like a barn. Next guy feels the tail and says, oh, no, it's kind of like a rope. And then the next guy feels the trunk and says, oh, the elephant is like a snake. And so maybe it's like a candy cane or blind man and the elephant, whatever you like. The candy cane interpretation is, right, the candy cane, I see only the red of it, you only see the white of it. And maybe the wind is like that, right? So maybe it's, the wind is kind of broken up. It has little parts, and you're experiencing a part, I'm experiencing a part, and we're both right of each of our parts. So the candy cane is red and white in that way, and the wind is cold and warm in this kind of fashion. So we're both right. So we're both giving the truth. But that has a bit of a problem because it seems to violate the spirit of this. Because in one sense we're right, but we're both incomplete. And so what also seems to be going on in the background here, and this is admittedly some in some interpretation here, is that it seems to be that Socrates is saying that not only it is what it is to me, but it is what it is for itself as well. So there's a strong kind of relativism in this, and it seems that you could run the line that there isn't actually any reality out there, but there's simply our interpretations and our perceptions of it. So I have my perception, you have yours. In a way, we kind of live in separate worlds. So in that sense, the candy cane thing may not work, and we move towards something. This has its problems, violates, as I said, it violates this spirit. So rather than that, we go into a kind of view of separate worlds. You have your world of interpretation where you're completely right. I have my world, and we don't really have a common world anymore. So we get rid of a lot on this interpretation. We get rid of the whole world, right? That is the notion of a common, independent of us world. That's one way to read it. Again, that's historically some interpreters in the early 20th century read it along those lines, that Socrates was offering some kind of quasi sort of private idealism, if you like. That could be debated. We could look at this slightly differently. Remember, interpretations are judgments made about the text. They have some support, they have trouble in other areas, and that's why people argue about them. Rarely can you find an interpretation that fits everything in the text. So a different way is to say something like this. All right, so from the candy cane to the separate worlds. Okay, we'll try. So these two are all problematic. All right, another way to interpret what's going on with the cold wind discussion and how we should read it is that it could be just a world out there where maybe in one sense, for the real world, does not apply, right? That the real external world, that temperature is just the feeling of hot and cold, is just a process of a combination of the external world and our bodies. But is the external world in and of itself really hot or really cold? No. There's just the external world and what's happening out there, but there's no such thing as hot and cold. Hot and cold are products of interactions. So would be taste, so would be sight, all these kinds of things. These are products of interactions between us and the world, something like that. So nobody can really talk about the wind in and of itself. So we're going to keep the external world, we'll call that the real world, but we're going to say that nobody can really talk about it. But again, your perception of it is true to you, and my perception of it is true to me. So, in that sense, we've got this external world. We can't really say what's going on in it, but we can talk about our perceptions of it as true for us. Well, that seems to be a little bit better, but Socrates goes further. Right? So now we're moving away from moving along, right, to the Homo-Mensura thesis. Now we're moving down into the Flux thesis. So what's going on here? Well, Socrates says, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. There is a secret doctrine. Seems in antiquity and actually through a lot of history, some philosophers like to say other philosophers presented secret doctrines. That there was one doctrine for everybody, and then there was a secret doctrine for the privileged, for the ones that were sort of in the gang or in the know, as they say. You find this a lot with sacred scriptures, that there was one level of interpretation for the common person. They would read things one way, but the scholars and the truly knowledgeable people would read scripture in a very different way. So truth had its notion of levels. This is not an unusual idea. It happens quite a bit. So what is this now? this secret doctrine. Okay? The secret doctrine of Protagoras. Well, think about it like this. So around so just about 152E around there, not too hard to find. He says something like this. There's no thing that is just one thing. Sounds pretty bizarre and complicated, but not if you think it through. Think it through of some of the reasoning that's been going on here. I'll try and lead you into this fairly gently. Say you call let's go back, use the elephant and the blind man. Forget about the blind stuff. Just take it as an ordinary elephant in an ordinary situation where the elephant can be seen. Socrates would say something like this. It's possible for that elephant to appear to you as very large, extremely large. Right? Where? Well, you're standing next to it. Yeah, it's going to be really big. That same property would apply to various things. It's possible for a mouse to appear very large to you. If you hold it right in front of your face, it would seem to be quite large. But it's also possible for that elephant to appear small. You just keep walking back and walking back. So it's possible for the elephant to take on different appearances, even to you. Now, this applies to all kinds of properties. Like Socrates says, sometimes they can appear heavy. Something can appear very heavy to you and very light, right? If I gave you something like a book or something, let's say a very large, heavy book, and I said, pick it up with 2 fingers, it would feel really heavy. But I said, yeah, use both hands. Oh, it feels very light. Same book. This idea that properties are there and they can change and that objects can appear to us in all different kinds of ways, Socrates wants to make the argument, and again, is it a good argument? People debate, but it's really telling us something about the nature of the world. And that the nature of the world has these things in it. For now, we'll just call them so that it has things in it, but a thing in it doesn't just appear as one way. It appears in different ways. So there is no thing that is just one thing. So you can't say the elephant is just heavy or just large, because elephants can appear in all kinds of ways. If you'd say can an elephant ever appear to you in a way that it's not heavy? Sure. If you had, some kind of machine that could lift an elephant, right? Or if you had some development where, a machine that would enable you to lift an elephant, something like that. It's possible, right? So properties are not really stuck to the object, fixed to the object. The objects can appear to us in a variety of ways. So there is this kind of flux of properties. So in that sense, there seems to be a problem when you stay with the notion that there's an underlying object, right? We saw that if you got rid of the world, right, you could sort of wiggle your way out of a problem over here. Well, why don't we try the same kind of thinking over here, that if we have no problems with the elephant appearing in different ways and all that, and we have a problem trying to say, well, what exactly is the elephant? What exactly is the property? Because the properties all seem to change all the time. Why don't we just think about moving away from the notion of fixed objects underneath all the properties and just think of the world as properties? You may think, well, that's pretty weird. But in one sense, we could just say there is no thing that is just one way. There really aren't. There are no things. And we say, what? Well, actually, before you get too upset about this is a long tradition, namely, it's sometimes referred to as process thought, that we should get away from thinking about the world as composed of hard little things with properties and just think of the world as composed of processes. What is a way to think of something that we normally think of a thing, but think of it as a process? Well, think about anything that you would regard as something stable and long-lasting, like a true thing in that thingy sense of the word. I can think of one. Think of the pyramids, Giza. Those seem to be pretty permanent. What are you talking about? They're processes. Well, you can if you open up to the possibility of thinking about time in a different way. Rather than thinking about short periods of time, think about the long period of time. When astronomers talk about the world being billions of years old, well, billions of years ago, those pyramids weren't there. Are they going to be here in billions of years? Probably not. If you start thinking about things even like the sun, well, it has a finite existence, and that existence of the sun started after the Big Bang. And depending on what theory, depending if there is ultimately a big crunch someday, the sun will be gone before then too. So objects that we want to attribute a kind of objective status to them and they're just taking on different properties, why don't we just talk about clusters of properties and forget about objects? Hume, centuries later, will talk in this way, and he will think and try and argue that the notion of substances and fixed things and identities, these are fictions. These are things that we postulate, that we say are out there, but maybe, probably likely, really aren't. Think about modern science. Modern science has gone from, long gone from the old view of atoms like little billiard balls and little solar systems to a very much more abstract and processual view. So things are like processes. It's not an irrational view. This is what seems to be coming out in the Flux thesis now. Reality is a giant flux. You catch some of it in your perceptions, but there's no solid basis underneath. So even this notion, and it's not quite right to say that existence is a property, but nothing is really in a state of pure existing, like that it is a fixed notion. Everything then, no things, there is only becoming and passing out of existence. That's what we have. So the pyramids came into existence. They are changing constantly. We can't see it, right? But if we could run a high-speed camera over all these years, yeah, you would notice things changing like crazy. Same with mountains. They didn't always exist and they won't always exist. These things change. It's just we have to get around our own narrow views of time because we're only here, sadly, for a short amount of time. We don't see change in everything. And if we don't see it, we assume it's not there. That's not a valid inference. That's not the right way to go. So the world then is just full of things that are coming to be and passing out. And again, it's hard to get around that thing talk, but it's just full of processes that are doing their stuff. And we then make judgments, erroneous judgments. All right. So there's nothing, that things are all ultimately processes, becoming, and there is just flux. Flux of processes. That's really the secret doctrine, and ultimately where all this leads. That knowledge as a thesis, eventually, if you think it through, you're eventually down into saying something about the world is one gigantic flux of properties. And it is a flux in and of itself, and that flux thesis is commonly associated with Heraclitus. So, Socrates says, well, you're in pretty good company if you think like this. You're in mighty company, as a matter of fact, my dear Theaetetus, because this has been a view that more or less you find in Homer, you find it in Protagoras. This is Socrates. This is Plato having Socrates do a quick little lesson in the tradition of Greek thought. Debatable, but we're trying to understand at least what's going on in the text. So Socrates says, you know what? This is not bad. This is kind of the shall we say, the procession of thought. You have mighty company, you have Homer on your side, you have Heraclitus, you have Protagoras. You don't have Parmenides, though. Parmenides was another great thinker in the tradition, and he rejected all this. He thought that everything was static and there weren't things, there was one thing. He had a totally different point of view, but he did not buy into the notion that there was change at all. So Socrates is saying that, well, with this second definition of knowledge, Theaetetus, we've now got to the point where this has moved us into thinking about the world as this notion of flux. What he's going to do now is examine this notion, the world of flux. Right? Our FT, our flux thesis. What Socrates is going to do is say, okay, we've been led down into this. If we want to really examine this flux thesis, because remember, Socrates started off earlier by saying, my dear Theaetetus, I am like a midwife. I want to encourage you to give birth to these ideas, and then we will see if it was a mere wind egg, if it is something that you gave birth to that ultimately I have to take away from you, that's not going to survive, it wasn't a healthy or a living birth, or it's something that's going to be great and we're going to keep it. But in order to make that decision, whether it's going to be a great offspring to keep or some kind of offspring that sadly I must take away from you, Socrates says we need to really examine this notion of the world of flux. What evidence is there for it? He's going to talk about why one might be led to believe that there is a world of flux. And what are some of the consequences of thinking that the world is a world of flux? So, in order to make that decision whether this is a wind egg or a good offspring that we should keep, we have to look at it from a variety of angles. What leads up to it? What's the evidence? And what are the consequences of holding this to be true? And that discussion going around will be dealt with at another time. Thank you.